In 1974, the historian John Henrik Clarke wrote a celebration. The occasion was the first United States publication of a book by the Senegalese scholar Cheikh Anta Diop, titled The African Origin of Civilization. Clarke called Diop one of the greatest living Black historians, a man whose work was steadily disturbing those white historians who had built quick reputations as authorities on Africa. This essay introduces Diop, his arguments, and the long tradition of scholars who insisted that African history is in truth the foundation of world history. Diop's central thesis is direct and unapologetic. Ancient Egypt, he argues, was a distinct African nation, African in origin and in early development, and not historically or culturally a part of Asia or Europe. Through Egyptian civilization, Africa made the oldest and one of the most significant contributions to world culture. Clarke frames Diop's writing alongside a wave of Black scholarship calling for a total reconsideration of the role African people played in the development of early societies and institutions. History, Diop insisted, cannot be written correctly until African historians connect it with the history of Egypt. First, the man himself. Born in a Senegalese town with a long tradition of producing Muslim scholars and oral historians. Cheikh Anta Diop was born in 1923 in Diourbel on the west coast of Africa, in a town long known for producing Muslim scholars and oral historians. There, his interest in history and the social sciences from an African point of view began. His first major work, Nations, Négresses et Culture, published in 1955, had been rejected as a doctoral thesis at the Sorbonne in Paris, yet it made him one of the most controversial African historians of his day. The book was both a reassessment of the African past and a direct challenge to Western scholarship on Africa. Diop's books challenged and changed the direction of attitudes about the place of African people in history in scholarly circles around the world. In 1966, at the World Festival of Arts held in Dakar, Senegal, he was honored together with W.e.b. Du Bois as the writer who had exerted the greatest influence on African people in the 20th century. The African Origin of Civilization, the book Clarke is introducing, is a one-volume English translation of major sections of his first and last French works, both originally published by Présence Africaine, the Paris-based arm of the International Society of African Culture. Diop approaches Africa head-on, asking the oldest and most charged question in the field. Diop asks plainly who the Egyptians of the ancient world were, and he answers with the ancients themselves. The Ethiopians said the Egyptians were one of their colonies, brought into Egypt by the deity Osiris. The Greek writer Herodotus repeatedly described the Egyptians as dark-skinned people with woolly hair, sharing the same tint of skin as the Ethiopians. Gaston Maspero summed up this near-unanimous testimony. The Egyptians belonged to an African race that first settled in Ethiopia on the Middle Nile, then followed the river down to the sea. Diop grants that Herodotus might misreport a custom, but surely could recognize skin color. Clarke adds a crucial caution about timing. When Herodotus visited Egypt between roughly 480 and 425 BC, Egypt's golden age was already over. The land had suffered repeated invasions, the Kushite invasions from within Africa beginning in 751 BC, and the Assyrian invasions from Western Asia starting in 671 BC. Egypt had lost its independence over a century before the Greek visitor arrived. If, even after generations of invasion and mixture, Egypt was still a distinct Black African nation in Herodotus's eyes, then surely, Clarke reasons, it was even more clearly so before those invasions ever occurred. In his first chapter, Diop traces the southern African origins of the people later known as Egyptians, and here he stands on firm ground, supported by neglected white scholars. Sir E.A. Wallace Budge wrote that the prehistoric native of Egypt, in both the Old and New Stone Ages, was African, with every reason to say the earliest settlers came from the south. Budge pointed toward an original homeland near Uganda and the land of Punt, which some place in modern Somalia. The Nile, Clarke notes, was a great cultural highway carrying the elements of civilization into and out of inner Africa. Diop's case did not begin with him. Clarke recovers a lineage of writers, African and European, who said the same thing. Clarke insists this is not a new argument born with Diop's generation. The Ghanaian historian Joseph B. Danquah said exactly the same thing in 1927, 4 years after Diop was born, writing that Imperial Ethiopia had conquered Egypt and founded the 25th dynasty, holding the central seat of world civilization while Rome was nowhere on the map. European interest in Ethiopia and the origin of civilization reached back to Carl Richard Lepsius and his survey of monumental ruins in the Ethiopian Nile Valley in the 1840s, whose records showed Ethiopia powerful enough to repeatedly conquer Egypt. Among the neglected European defenders, Clarke highlights two: Arnold Hermann Heeren, professor at Göttingen and an early exponent of the economic interpretation of history, argued in 1825 that international trade was first developed among the ancient black peoples of Africa and Asia, and that this exchange laid the foundations of the earliest civilizations. The French writer Count Volney, in The Ruins of Empires, declared the Egyptians the first people to attain the sciences necessary to civilized life, and that it was on the borders of the Upper Nile, among a black race of men, that the worship of the stars and the labors of agriculture were first organized. This radical tradition was carried forward by African American historians. More than a generation before, Carter G. Woodson, W.e.b. Du Bois, Willis N. Huggins, J.A. Rogers, and Charles C. Seifert read these writers and expanded on their findings. The work continued into Diop's own day, reflected in John G. Jackson's Introduction to African Civilizations, Yosef Ben Johannan's Black Man of the Nile, and Chancellor Williams's The Destruction of Black Civilization. In the United States, Diop himself remained known only to a small circle of black writers and teachers until articles and interviews in the early 1970s finally brought him wider attention. The final movement turns to the machinery of distortion and how it was built alongside the slave trade. Egyptology, Clarke writes, developed in concurrence with the slave trade and the colonial system. It was during this period that Egypt was literally taken out of Africa academically and made an extension of Europe. Western historians rested the foundation of so-called Western civilization on the false claim that the ancient Egyptians were white. To do so, they had to ignore masterpieces by white scholars who disagreed, such as Gerald Massey's Ancient Egypt, the Light of the World. The dilemma of Egypt in Western historiography, Diop and Clarke agree, is a created dilemma, not a real one. Diop devotes chapters to the manufacture of distortion. In Birth of the Negro myth, he shows how African people, whose civilizations were old before Europe was born, were systematically read out of the respectful commentary of human history. In Modern Falsification of History, he traces how Western historians, over the last 500 years, wrote and rewrote the past to glorify people of European extraction, while distorting the history of the rest of the world. Diop also recounts the Hyksos period and the Jews who entered Egypt and left 4 centuries later an ethnically and religiously African people. Clarke closes as he began, with celebration. Those who read Diop seriously, he warns, are in for a shock and a rewarding experience in learning. This is a major work by a major Black historian. At last, Clarke declares, the renaissance of African historiography from an African point of view has begun, and none too soon. To evade the problem of Egypt, Diop had written, is to be not modest or objective, but ignorant and cowardly. The publication of The African Origin of Civilization, Clarke repeats, is a cause for celebration.